The wedding was perfect. Every detail, every flower, every candle, every moment, was crafted to be flawless. But as the cathedral doors swung open and the bride stepped down the aisle, the one person who wasn't supposed to matter, the groom, had his eyes fixed on someone else. Me. Welcome back to Flox's Shifter Romance Tales. If you're new here, get comfortable, you're going to want to stay. Hit the subscribe button, and like. Grab your favorite drink, settle in, and let's begin. The sound of the cathedral bells resonated through the air, their deep, booming notes vibrating against the cold stone walls, and I felt it, a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. The ceremony was unfolding beautifully, the flowers arranged just as I had planned, a breathtaking sea of white lilies and cream-colored roses cascading from every corner. The 300 hand-dipped candles that lined the pews flickered softly, casting an amber glow that bathed the space in warmth. Everything was perfect. And yet, there was something wrong. Not with the music. Not with the seating. Not with the design or the flow. Everything that I had spent the past 6 weeks crafting was exactly where it should be, down to the smallest detail. But there he stood, the groom. Alpha King Julius Creston of the Northern Isles stood tall and regal at the altar, his dark brown hair slightly tousled, his shoulders broad and commanding beneath his black, embroidered coat. He was everything a king should be, powerful, stoic, untouchable. And yet, he was staring not at his bride, who had yet to make her entrance, but at *me star. I, Emma Harrow, the wedding planner, wasn't supposed to exist in this moment. The planner was meant to be invisible. A shadow. A behind-the-scenes architect of perfection. The groom was supposed to be focused on his bride. The bride was meant to capture everyone's attention as she walked down the aisle. And the planner, well, the planner was a mere facilitator. Yet, here I was, standing at the far end of the cathedral, concealed behind a stone pillar, my folio pressed to my chest, my quill tucked behind my ear. I had purposely chosen this position, out of sight of everyone except the one person whose gaze had been following me since the moment we met. His stormy hazel eyes locked with mine, unblinking. There was a fire in them, something that burned far deeper than simple curiosity or politeness. And in that moment, I could have sworn the temperature in the entire cathedral rose. I tried to ignore it. I focused on my folio, checking off the last-minute details, counting the candles, adjusting the seating arrangements in my head. Anything to distract myself from that all-consuming, heart-stopping feeling that had started the moment he walked into my life. 6 weeks ago, it had all started with a letter. I'd been sitting in my cramped office above the florist's shop, a cup of lukewarm tea in hand, reviewing the final drafts of my latest wedding plan when the courier had arrived. The letter was sealed with a royal wax, a dark blue, stamped with the unmistakable insignia of the Northern Isles. My fingers trembled as I opened it, and I read the letter twice before I set it down, as if the words on the page might somehow combust into flames. Alpha King Julius Creston requested the services of Emma Harrow, wedding planner, for his upcoming bonding ceremony to Lady Isabella Vane, daughter of the esteemed House Vane from the Southern Plains. The ceremony would take place in the Grand St. Lawrence Cathedral. The budget? Not a concern. The details? To be left to me. I stared at the letter in shock, the weight of the commission settling over me. This was *it star. The opportunity of a lifetime. The kind of commission that could elevate my career, put my name on the lips of every noble house across the realm. I had said yes, without hesitation. But the tremor in my hands, the flutter in my chest, I told myself it was just the excitement, the business opportunity. Nothing more. The first time I met him, I was standing alone in the cathedral, measuring the aisle for the perfect seating arrangement. The space was massive, cold stones stretching high above me, but I was in my element, lost in the details. The quiet hum of the echoing space felt like the calm before the storm of the wedding. "You're Emma Harrow, the wedding planner," a voice called out behind me. I spun around, startled, and there he stood, King Julius Creston. Tall, broad-shouldered, dressed simply in a dark tunic and long boots, his hair ruffled from the journey. He looked nothing like the groom I had expected. He didn't wear the weight of the crown or the formal attire of a king. He looked like a man, just a man, who had come to do something that mattered. I curtsied, every muscle in my body screaming at me to remain professional, to stay detached. "Your Majesty, I wasn't expecting you until the afternoon briefing." He stepped forward, climbing the altar steps, his eyes never leaving me. As he passed, a wave of warmth washed over me, an intense heat that radiated from him, and for the briefest moment, I wondered if the candles had somehow lit themselves early. He paused at the top of the steps, his gaze sweeping the space with the same intensity with which he was looking at me. "You've already started the measurements," he said. His voice was quiet, contemplative, not the voice of a king giving orders, but of someone genuinely curious. "Yes," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "The aisle is a little narrow. I'll either adjust the bride's train or move the pews back." "The pews will work better." He raised an eyebrow, clearly impressed. "You're very good at this." "I'm paid to be," I said, managing a smile, hoping my calm exterior would mask the frantic beating of my heart. He nodded, but there was something in his eyes that made the room feel smaller, the air warmer. He looked at me as if I were the most important person in the room, and that was the last thing I needed. But for reasons I couldn't explain, I wanted to feel it. I wanted to be the one he looked at like that. The letter had arrived on a crisp Tuesday morning, the day the autumn winds began to strip the trees of their leaves, the day the world seemed to shift just a little. I had been sitting at my desk, quietly sipping a lukewarm cup of tea and reviewing the floral arrangements for a local wedding, when the courier knocked on the door. His presence was ordinary, his footsteps light against the floorboards, but the seal he carried, the royal blue wax stamped with the Northern Isles insignia, was anything but. I had recognized it immediately. No one in the realm could miss it. I set my tea down and took the letter from his hand, carefully breaking the seal. The paper inside was thick, the ink bold and precise. As I read the words for the first time, I was struck with a sense of surreal disbelief, as if the universe itself had conspired to drop a monumental opportunity into my lap. Alpha King Julius Creston had requested the services of Emma Harrow, wedding planner, for his upcoming bonding ceremony with Lady Isabella Vane, the daughter of one of the most powerful families in the Southern Plains. The ceremony would take place in the legendary St. Lawrence Cathedral, a grand and historic venue I had long dreamed of working in. And the budget? Unrestricted. Not a concern, the letter stated, though I could feel the weight of those words in my chest. There would be no compromises, no second guesses. Everything had to be perfect. I had stared at the letter for several moments, my hands shaking slightly, though I tried to convince myself it was due to the sheer excitement of the opportunity. My entire career had been building toward this moment, the chance to work with royalty, to have my name associated with the highest circles in the land. The other wedding planners would be envious. The other noble houses would whisper my name with awe. This was what I had worked for, and yet, despite my steady pulse and calm exterior, there was something in the pit of my stomach. An unease I couldn't explain. "Say yes," I told myself. "You can't say no to something like this." And so, I said yes. The morning of the first meeting had arrived far too quickly. I had packed my trunk with my finest garments, my most organized planning folio, and a sharp quill that I always carried with me to every job. The meeting was to be held in the St. Lawrence Cathedral, the grandest venue I had ever stepped foot in. I arrived early, the morning mist still hanging low in the air as I made my way through the cathedral's heavy iron doors. The cathedral's cavernous interior greeted me with its towering columns and stunning stained glass windows. It was both majestic and intimidating. I had come early to get a feel for the space. I wanted to know where the light would fall in the afternoon, where the shadows would stretch across the stone floors, and how the acoustics would carry the vows of the bride and groom. Every detail mattered. Nothing could be left to chance. As I made my way down the aisle, measuring cord in hand, I heard footsteps approaching. The sound was slow, deliberate. A man's footsteps. When I turned around, there he stood, Julius Creston, the Alpha King of the Northern Isles. His presence seemed to fill the entire space, making the air crackle with energy. His broad shoulders, dark brown hair, and stormy hazel eyes commanded attention. He didn't wear the weight of his crown or the adornments of his royal lineage. He looked human. Just a man. And yet, there was something about him that made my heart race. "Emma Harrow," he said, his voice deep and smooth, carrying effortlessly through the cathedral. "The wedding planner." I felt a flush of warmth spread across my chest, but I quickly curtsied, lowering my head to show the proper respect. "Your Majesty, I wasn't expecting you until the afternoon briefing," I said, though I could hardly focus on the words, not when he was standing so close, his eyes fixed on mine with an intensity that made it hard to breathe. "I wanted to see the space before the ceremony," he said, climbing the steps toward the altar. "The grand design, the space you've been shaping." I watched him, trying to remain composed, but the energy between us was undeniable. Every time his gaze met mine, I felt something stir inside me. Something dangerous. You've already started the measurements. His voice broke through my thoughts, and I looked down at my cord, fumbling for a response. Yes, I replied, my voice slightly shakier than I would have liked. The aisle is 3 feet narrower than standard. I was thinking of adjusting the pews back a bit. He nodded, his attention still fixed on me. You're very good at this. I'm paid to be, I said, trying to force some lightness into my words, but it was hard. My pulse was hammering in my ears, and I couldn't seem to steady my breathing. He was so close now, close enough that I could smell the faint scent of fresh wood, the earthy undertones of his clothes, and something deeper, something that was distinctly him. Something that made my heart race faster. I couldn't let it happen. I couldn't let myself get distracted. I had a job to do. But as he stepped closer, the warmth hit again. It was a subtle thing at first, a gentle heat that radiated from him, but it grew more intense with each passing second. My hand tightened around the measuring cord, my skin tingling where the heat pressed against it. The air around me felt thick, charged. There was no reason for it, and yet, I couldn't deny the pull I felt toward him. Over the next several weeks, I found myself immersed in the work, drowning in the details of the wedding. Every conversation, every meeting, every moment was filled with the meticulous planning that I prided myself on. I had to be perfect. There was no room for error. But he was everywhere. He attended every planning meeting. Every single one. In my experience, grooms attended the first meeting and the final tasting. And that was it. They rarely had time for the in-between. But not King Julius. He was present, engaged, asking questions, genuinely interested in the process. His deep voice would carry through every meeting, listening intently as I explained the reasoning behind each choice. Why foxglove over roses? Why the musicians should be placed in the gallery? Why the vows should be spoken facing west, rather than east? And every time I spoke, every time I answered his questions, his eyes would linger on me a little longer, as though he was seeing me in a way no one else had. No one had ever made me feel like that. No one had ever seen me like he did. One evening, when we were finalizing the seating chart, I was arranging the last few names when I noticed him standing much closer than usual. He reached out, adjusting a card on the table, his fingers brushing against mine. The warmth surged through me again, intense and unrelenting. I quickly withdrew my hand, my heart pounding in my chest. I'm sorry, he said softly, his eyes meeting mine. I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable. It's fine, I replied, forcing a smile. It's just a lot of details to manage. I understand, he said, his voice low. But you're doing an extraordinary job, Emma. He was right. I was doing my job well. But it was getting harder to ignore the feelings that were building inside me, feelings I knew I couldn't afford. I was here to do a job, not to fall in love with a man who would never be mine. The tasting was the worst. I had arranged 12 courses for the royal reception, each dish a sample of what would be served at the grand feast. Julius had been there, of course, tasting every course with the kind of attention he usually reserved for matters of state. He offered feedback on the texture of the bread, the seasoning of the meats, the balance of the wine. It was exhausting, but strangely intimate. By the time we reached the final course, a honey cake with cardamom cream, I was ready to collapse. But then he held a forkful out to me, his gaze steady and insistent. You haven't eaten anything, he said, his tone soft, almost coaxing. You've been standing there all day. I'm working, I replied, my voice distant. I'll eat later. He smiled, though it was a little strained. Eat now. Before I could protest, he placed the fork in my hand. Our fingers brushed once more, and that familiar warmth surged through me, so intense it almost knocked the breath out of me. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I took a bite, the sweetness of the honey cake filling my mouth, and I felt him watching me, his eyes intense. There was an unspoken tension in the air, a connection that was impossible to deny. But I had to. I excused myself from the table, my heart racing, my mind spinning. I told myself I was just tired, that I needed a break from the overwhelming pressure of the wedding. But deep down, I knew the truth. It wasn't the wedding. It was him. The days after the tasting blurred into a series of meetings, adjustments, and fleeting moments where I tried to regain some sense of control. But the problem was no longer the details of the wedding. The problem was Julius. Every time he was near, that same warmth would rise, making my skin flush and my heart race. It wasn't just the proximity or the undeniable chemistry, it was something deeper, something I couldn't explain, and certainly not control. The last thing I wanted was to complicate this job with emotions that had no place here. But every time his eyes met mine, it was as though the rest of the world faded away. I had built a career on being precise, on being steady, and on being invisible to everyone except the people who needed me. But Julius was different. He saw me, and that terrified me. It was during one of those late-night sessions in the chapel that I began to truly understand the gravity of the situation. We had been reviewing the final layout for the ceremony, adjusting the placements of the ceremonial banners, ensuring every detail aligned perfectly with the light streaming through the stained glass windows. It had been hours, and by now, my back ached, my feet were sore, and I was more than ready for the night to be over. But Julius remained. He always did. "I can handle this," I muttered under my breath, making adjustments to the velvet banners hanging along the altar. It wasn't like I wanted him there, hovering behind me, asking questions that went far beyond the ceremony itself. But the reality was that he was a constant now. He had become woven into every aspect of this wedding. "You've done an incredible job," he said, breaking the silence as I adjusted the drapery. I could hear the smile in his voice, but there was something else there, something deeper, something laced with an emotion that I couldn't quite place. I straightened up and turned to him, trying to ignore the fluttering in my chest. "I told you before, Your Majesty, I'm just doing my job." He shook his head slowly, his gaze not leaving mine. "It's more than that, Emma. You've created something beautiful." I stared at him for a moment, trying to decipher the weight of his words. There was something in the way he said it that made me feel seen in a way I hadn't expected. It was as if he wasn't just complimenting my work but acknowledging something deeper, something more personal. My heart beat a little faster. "It's just a wedding," I said, trying to dismiss the feeling, trying to shrink away from the warmth that had once again begun to envelop me. "No," he replied, his voice softer now. "It's more than just a wedding. It's an entire future. You've shaped this day, Emma. You've created a memory that will last a lifetime." I could feel the space between us closing as he stepped forward, slowly, deliberately. The warmth between us increased with every inch, until it felt like the very air was charged with energy. He stopped just a foot away, and for the first time in all these weeks, I noticed the subtle tension in his body. The way his jaw tightened slightly, the way his eyes darted to my lips before quickly looking back to my eyes. It wasn't just the ceremony he was talking about, I realized. It was us. His voice dropped to a whisper. "I want you to know something, Emma." I swallowed hard, unsure if I wanted to hear what he had to say. But the way he looked at me, with those stormy, captivating eyes, made it impossible to look away. "I didn't come here just to marry Isabella," he said, his tone serious, his eyes unwavering. "I came here because I needed you. I needed someone who understood the details, someone who could help me navigate all of this." But somewhere along the way, he trailed off, his chest rising and falling with a deep breath, as if he were gathering the courage to speak something he hadn't yet allowed himself to say. I felt my heart tighten in my chest. "Julius," I began, but he raised a hand, silencing me. "I'm not marrying Isabella because I have to," he continued, his voice low and steady. "I'm marrying her because it was arranged. But I don't feel what I'm supposed to feel for her. Not in the way I've started to feel about you." My breath hitched, and I instinctively took a step back, as if distancing myself could somehow make this all go away. But the truth was, it wasn't just his words that had me reeling. It was the way he said them, the sincerity, the raw emotion in his voice that felt like a confession. It was as though he had laid bare his heart before me, and I wasn't sure I could handle the weight of it. "You don't mean that," I said, my voice shaking, though I tried to make it sound firm. "You're just caught up in the excitement of the wedding. The pressure. The stress. It's all part of the process." "No," he said softly, taking another step closer. "It's not. I've never felt this way about anyone before, Emma. I can't pretend it doesn't exist." I stared at him, my mind racing. "You don't know what you're saying. This is a political marriage. You have responsibilities, duties. You can't just walk away from all of that because of a fleeting moment of attraction." His face softened, and he reached out, gently placing a hand on my arm. "This isn't a fleeting moment. This is something real." I felt the heat of his touch like a shock, an electric current that sent a wave of warmth through my entire body. His fingers curled lightly around my arm, his grip firm, but not demanding. The air between us was thick now, as though every word we spoke added another layer of intensity. "This can't happen," I said, barely above a whisper, though I wasn't sure I believed my own words anymore. "Why?" he asked, his voice still gentle, but there was a trace of vulnerability there, the first time I had ever heard it in his tone. "Why can't it happen, Emma?" I opened my mouth to respond, but the words caught in my throat. What could I possibly say? That he was the king, and I was just the wedding planner? That the role I had crafted for myself had no room for love, for feelings that had no place in my carefully constructed world? But before I could find the right words, Julius closed the distance between us, his hand still resting lightly on my arm, but now his other hand cupped my chin gently, urging me to meet his gaze. "I don't know what the future holds, but I know this, Emma." He paused, his thumb gently tracing the curve of my jaw, sending a shiver down my spine. "What I feel for you is not something I can ignore. Not anymore." His words hung in the air, and the reality of them hit me like a tidal wave. I had spent the past few weeks telling myself that this attraction, this undeniable connection, was nothing more than a distraction. A fleeting moment, born out of the stress of the wedding and the constant proximity we had shared. But now, looking into his eyes, I realized it was so much more. It wasn't a distraction. It was something real. The weeks following that night in the chapel garden had been a blur of emotions I couldn't afford to examine. Every detail of the wedding had to be perfect, and I had buried myself in my work, finding solace in the familiar structure of my role as the wedding planner. This was the one thing I could control, my precise measurements, my careful attention to every arrangement. I couldn't afford to let my feelings for Julius interfere with that. But how could I ignore him? How could I ignore the way he looked at me, the way he saw me when no one else ever had? And yet, I had no choice. He was the king. He was marrying Lady Isabella Vane, a political alliance that I had no right to interrupt, no right to feel anything more than the distance a professional should feel. So, I did what I had always done best. I threw myself into the details of the wedding. I spent late nights in the chapel, reviewing every angle of the ceremony, ensuring everything was exactly as it should be. Every candle, every flower, every inch of fabric. It was the only thing that kept my mind from wandering back to the king, to his words in the garden, to the way his touch lingered on my skin. It was the night before the rehearsal when everything came to a head. The ceremony was tomorrow, and the pressure had been building to its peak. My assistants had all gone home for the night, and I was alone in the cathedral, standing at the altar, ensuring that the candlelight would be perfect for the bride's entrance. My hands trembled as I checked and rechecked the distance between the candles, my mind racing. Every detail had to be flawless. I was so caught up in my thoughts that I didn't hear him approach. Julius's presence was like a storm cloud before a downpour, always felt before seen. "I thought I'd find you here," his voice broke through the silence, low and steady. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. "You shouldn't be here, Your Majesty," I said, turning to face him, trying to keep the professionalism in my voice, though it was shaky. "The rehearsal is tomorrow. You should be resting." He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he took a few steps toward me, his gaze never leaving mine. The warmth that always seemed to radiate from him surrounded me, just like it always did when he was near. My breath caught in my throat, and I cursed myself for allowing this feeling to take hold. "I've already rested," he said softly, his tone barely above a whisper. "I've been thinking about something else." I frowned, trying to maintain my composure. "You have a wedding to attend tomorrow. Lady Isabella is expecting you at the rehearsal." He shook his head, stepping closer, his hand brushing against mine as he reached for the candle beside me. I tried to pull away, but his touch lingered, sending a jolt of electricity through my body. "I've been thinking about you, Emma," he said, his voice filled with a raw honesty that took me off guard. "I've been thinking about what we've talked about, what we've shared." His words hung in the air like a challenge, a dare, and I wasn't sure how to respond. This wasn't supposed to happen. He wasn't supposed to feel this way. He was a king, and I was just a planner. My job was to make his wedding beautiful, not to become tangled in emotions I couldn't control. "Your Majesty," I said, my voice faltering. "This isn't right. We both know this. I am your wedding planner. You're marrying Lady Isabella tomorrow. This is my job, and I can't." "You don't have to finish that sentence," he interrupted, his voice low but firm. I know what you're going to say. You don't have to remind me of my duties. I took a step back, trying to distance myself from the intensity of his gaze. You have responsibilities. We both have them, I said, my voice barely a whisper. We can't cross this line. It's not right. His eyes softened, and he took another step forward, closing the distance between us. You think I don't know that? You think I don't feel the weight of my crown, of my responsibilities? But, Emma, he reached out, his hand gently cupping my chin, urging me to meet his eyes. This is real. What I feel for you is real. I felt a lump form in my throat, and for a moment, I couldn't speak. How could I? What he was saying was impossible. But the truth was, I couldn't deny what had been growing between us for weeks. Every meeting, every glance, every touch had only made the pull stronger. I don't know how to fix this, I finally whispered, my heart racing in my chest. I can't just pretend it's not happening. He smiled, but it was a sad, weary smile. I don't want you to pretend, Emma. I want you to be honest with me. There was a long silence between us, one that stretched out like an eternity. My mind raced as I tried to come to terms with what was happening. Every part of me screamed that this couldn't happen, that I couldn't allow myself to fall for him. But the pull, the connection, was undeniable. I don't know how to let go of this, I said, my voice trembling. This feeling, you've made me feel seen in a way that no one ever has. But I can't. You don't have to let go, he said quietly. I'm not asking you to. I'm asking you to feel. His hand was still resting gently on my chin, and I closed my eyes, trying to control my racing pulse. I could feel the heat of his hand on my skin, his presence overwhelming me. Tomorrow, you're marrying Lady Isabella, I reminded him, the words slipping out before I could stop them. The ceremony is already planned. The guests are arriving. The whole world is expecting you to go through with it. I'm not marrying Isabella tomorrow, Julius said, his voice steady and calm, though there was a fire in his eyes that spoke of something more. I'm marrying you. I shook my head in disbelief. What are you talking about? You've already made promises, Julius. Your council will never allow this. Your family. I've spoken with them, he interrupted, his grip on my chin tightening slightly. I've already told them that this wedding is a formality. I've told them that I cannot marry someone I don't love. I'm not going through with it. Not for them. Not for anyone. I stared at him, shocked. You're talking about ruining everything. The alliance, the politics, the expectations. He stepped closer, his body nearly pressing against mine now, his breath warm against my cheek. I don't care about the politics. I care about you. You've become more than just a planner to me. You've become everything. I swallowed hard, fighting against the overwhelming desire that surged within me. This wasn't possible. This couldn't be real. You have to understand, he continued, his voice desperate now. I know the weight of my duty, Emma, but I can't ignore this. I can't ignore you. I closed my eyes, taking a deep breath. His words were making my head spin, and I felt as though I were drowning in them. But in the deepest part of my heart, I knew he was right. I felt it too. I felt it every time he looked at me, every time our hands brushed, every time his voice lowered to that intimate whisper. But the truth was, I couldn't let go of everything I had worked for, everything I had built. I couldn't just throw away my career, my stability, and my entire life. I had a plan. I had structure. I had control. And then there was Julius. The king. The man I could never have. I stepped back from him, my chest tight with emotion. I can't, Julius, I whispered, shaking my head. I can't be the one to make you turn your back on everything you've built. You already have, Emma, he said softly, his voice filled with a quiet, painful certainty. And I've never been more grateful for it. The day of the wedding had arrived, the day I had spent 6 long weeks meticulously planning, obsessing over every detail, every arrangement. The air was thick with tension as I moved through the cathedral, making final checks, ensuring the candles were perfectly aligned, that the seating chart was flawless, and that every last flower was in place. The ceremony was hours away, but the cathedral was already alive with the hum of anticipation, the buzz of activity as the guests began to arrive. And yet, despite the fervor of preparations, a part of me was frozen. I couldn't stop thinking about Julius. I had never been so divided in my life. On one hand, I was the wedding planner, professional, controlled, focused on the task at hand. But on the other hand, I was a woman who had fallen hopelessly, irrevocably in love with a man who wasn't hers to have. A man who was, even now, about to marry someone else in front of hundreds of guests, as part of a political arrangement that meant far more to him than any personal feelings. The weight of it all pressed on my chest, and I couldn't seem to breathe. The cathedral walls, so grand and encompassing, seemed to close in around me, reminding me of the boundaries I had spent my whole life carefully constructing. Boundaries I was now unwillingly questioning. I paused at the altar, looking up at the towering stained-glass windows that filtered the sunlight into a soft rainbow of colors. The afternoon light was perfect, casting shadows that danced across the stone floors, just as I had planned. Everything was as it should be. Everything except him. I felt his presence before I saw him. Emma. The sound of his voice sent a ripple through my spine, and I turned slowly, almost unwillingly, to face him. Julius stood a few feet away, his broad shoulders framed by the towering pillars, his eyes intense and focused on me as if he were searching for something deep and hidden within me. His gaze was unwavering, the stormy hazel eyes that I had spent so many nights trying to avoid now impossible to ignore. His very presence seemed to radiate warmth, something tangible, something that made my heart thump loudly in my chest. It was impossible to look at him and not feel the fire that we both knew was burning beneath the surface. "Julius," I whispered, my voice barely audible, betraying the emotions I had been trying so hard to keep buried. He didn't say anything at first, just watched me with that same steady, knowing look. His presence seemed to fill the space between us, and for a moment, neither of us moved. We were trapped in a suspended moment of time, the cathedral surrounding us like a bubble, isolating us from the world. "I thought you'd be with Isabella," I said, my words trembling as I spoke. "The ceremony is soon. Everyone is expecting you to go through with it." Julius took a slow step forward, his boots making a soft echo on the stone floor. "I'm not going through with it, Emma," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Not unless you're standing by my side." The words hit me like a punch to the stomach, and I felt the blood drain from my face. "What are you talking about?" I managed to whisper, my mind scrambling to process what he was saying. "You can't just call off your wedding. It's not that simple. There are too many people involved. The politics, the alliances. It's not just about what we feel." His eyes softened slightly, the storm clouds in them giving way to something gentler, something more vulnerable. "I'm not asking you to ignore everything, Emma. I'm asking you to feel. I'm asking you to be honest with me, as I've tried to be with you." I shook my head, stepping back as if trying to create some physical distance between us. "You're asking me to throw away everything I've worked for. My career, my reputation. Everything I've spent my life building. You want me to walk away from that for you?" "Not just for me," he said softly, his voice low and almost pleading. "For us. I know it's not easy. I know there's a lot at stake. But I've spent 6 weeks with you, Emma. 6 weeks of planning, of watching you work, of seeing how your mind works. You've changed everything for me. I'm not the man I was before I met you." "Julius," I whispered, my heart breaking in my chest. "You're the king. You have a duty. You can't just throw it all away." "I'm not throwing anything away," he said, his voice firm. "What I'm throwing away is the idea that I have to follow the path that's been laid out for me. I don't want to be a puppet, Emma. I don't want to marry someone I don't love. I don't want to live a life that's been dictated to me." I felt my legs weaken beneath me as the weight of his words sank in. My whole life, I had built walls around myself. I had prided myself on being the calm, collected wedding planner who could be invisible and fade into the background. I had never allowed myself to fall in love. I had never let anyone close enough to break through those walls. But Julius, he had shattered them, piece by piece. And now, standing in front of me, he was asking me to choose him. To choose a life with him. A life I hadn't prepared for. A life that was uncertain and messy, but a life that might just be worth living. But it was also a life filled with consequences. "I can't," I said, shaking my head, the words choking me. "I can't be the one to make you break your promises. You're marrying Isabella for the kingdom. For your people. For your future." His eyes never wavered, the intensity only deepening. "I'm marrying you, Emma," he said, taking another step forward, closing the distance between us. "I've made my decision." Before I could respond, he reached out and cupped my face in his hands, his touch gentle but insistent. My heart raced as I looked up at him, my breath shallow, my thoughts clouded with doubt and fear. "Please," he whispered, his lips barely brushing my ear. "Don't let fear control us. Don't let duty keep us apart." The warmth between us flared again, stronger than ever before. I closed my eyes, overwhelmed by the sensations flooding my body. His presence was all-encompassing, his touch igniting something deep inside me, something I had spent so long suppressing. For a moment, I thought I might lose myself to him entirely. But then, reality hit me. I pulled back, breaking free from his touch, my hands trembling. "This isn't just about us," I said, my voice firm, though it shook with emotion. "This is about the kingdom. The people. The alliances that you've made. You can't just throw it all away because of something that might not even last. This isn't just your life, Julius. It's everyone's life. You have a responsibility." He stood there for a moment, silent, his hands dropping to his sides. I could see the frustration and the pain in his eyes, but there was also something else. Something stronger. "And what about your responsibility, Emma?" he asked quietly. "What about your life? What about what you want?" I didn't have an answer. I couldn't find the words to explain what I was feeling, what I was going through. All I knew was that my heart was torn between two worlds, the world I had spent my whole life building, and the world he was offering me, a world of uncertainty, passion, and love. "I don't know," I whispered, my voice cracking. "I don't know what I want anymore." He stepped forward again, his hands reaching for mine, his touch so gentle, so sure. "Then let's figure it out together." The guests were seated, the air thick with anticipation. The music played softly in the background, the first notes of the processional signaling the beginning of the wedding. I stood at the back of the cathedral, watching as Lady Isabella Vane walked down the aisle, her gown of ivory silk shimmering in the soft light. She was beautiful, poised, calm. But I couldn't focus on her. My eyes were locked on Julius. He stood at the altar, his posture regal but his eyes were searching for me. The ceremony had begun, but I could hardly hear the vows being exchanged. All I could hear was the pounding of my own heart, and all I could see was the king who had stolen my heart. And then, as the vows continued, something shifted. Julius looked at me, his gaze steady and unwavering. His lips parted, and for a brief moment I thought he was about to say something. But the moment was shattered by the sound of Lady Isabella's voice, calm and steady. "I don't want to marry him," she said, her words ringing clear in the silence of the cathedral. The silence that followed Isabella's declaration was suffocating. The cathedral, which had been filled with the soft hum of whispered conversations and the rustling of dresses, suddenly felt unbearably still. The guests were frozen in place, unsure of how to react. My heart pounded in my chest, not from the wedding drama unfolding before me, but because of the man standing at the altar, his eyes locked with mine. Julius had been the center of my every thought for weeks. His presence had permeated every aspect of my work, every conversation we'd had, every shared moment. And now, as he stood there, his stormy hazel eyes locked on mine, it was clear that everything was about to change. I could see the internal struggle written across his face. He was a man divided between the responsibilities that came with his crown and the emotions he could no longer deny. His body stiffened, and for a brief moment I thought he might step away, that the walls he had built would close in around him again. But he didn't. Instead, he took a step toward Isabella, and the collective breath of the room seemed to catch. He reached out, gently taking her hand in his. The calm, almost resigned expression on his face told me everything I needed to know. He wasn't fighting her decision, nor was he about to back out of what had already been set in motion. There was something else going on, something more personal. "I will not marry you," he said, his voice clear and firm, echoing through the cathedral. Isabella's lips trembled, but her composure never wavered. "I understand," she replied softly, her eyes casting a glance toward the guests before settling on Julius. "You never truly wanted this. You've made your feelings clear." I stood frozen at the back of the cathedral, torn between disbelief and something else, something deeper that I couldn't quite place. I felt my knees weaken beneath me as the realization set in. He was choosing me. But how could I let him? How could I let him choose me over duty, over the kingdom, over the people who had relied on him for so long? What kind of future could we possibly have? I tried to turn away, my eyes darting to the carefully arranged flowers, the rows of pews, the flickering candlelight. Anything to distract myself from the overwhelming emotions threatening to crash over me. But there was no escaping the truth that had become painfully obvious. He had chosen me. I had known for weeks that I was falling in love with Julius. It wasn't something I had planned, nor had it been a conscious decision. But now, standing in the cathedral where I had spent so many hours working, I realized just how deeply I had fallen. Emma. Julius's voice broke through the silence, and I slowly turned to face him. His eyes were filled with an intensity one had never seen before, an emotion that was as raw and real as the pulse racing through my veins. "You don't have to do this," I said, my voice shaking as I took a step back. "You don't have to ruin everything. Your council, your people, they won't forgive you for this. You have a responsibility to them." "I did have a responsibility," Julius replied softly, his voice steady, but there was an undeniable edge to it. "But I'm tired of living a life dictated by obligations. I've spent so much time fulfilling duties that I lost sight of what truly matters, what I truly want." I swallowed hard, my heart aching as I looked at him, standing there with his hands trembling, his chest rising and falling with each breath. He was torn, caught between the world he had always known and the world he was trying to build with me. "But I'm not the woman you're supposed to marry," I whispered, the words choking me. "I'm the wedding planner. I'm just a woman who's been doing her job." "No, Emma," he said, taking a step closer, his hand reaching for mine. "You're so much more than that. You've been the one who's seen me for who I really am. Not just as a king, not as a ruler, but as a person who is capable of love, capable of breaking free from the chains that have bound me for so long." I felt his hand take mine, the warmth of his skin sending a jolt of electricity through my body. For a moment, I thought I might lose my balance, that the world would spin out of control. But his grip steadied me, grounding me to the reality of what was happening. "I can't ignore this any longer," he continued, his voice quieter now, more intimate. "I can't keep pretending that I don't want you by my side." My breath caught in my throat. His words were a confession, and they unraveled every thread of control I had left. "You want me?" I whispered, almost not daring to ask. "You want this?" "Yes," he answered, his eyes locking with mine, unwavering. "I want you, Emma. I want us. I've never been more sure of anything in my life." The room felt suffocating, the weight of a decision hanging over me like a storm cloud, pressing against my chest. This wasn't a decision I could make lightly. This was a choice that would change everything, not just for me, but for Julius, for the kingdom, for the future that had already been set in motion. I closed my eyes, the sound of the guests whispering and murmuring around us fading into the background. I couldn't focus on them. I couldn't focus on the outside world anymore. All I could hear was the pounding of my own heart. All I could feel was the warmth of Julius's hand in mine. "What are we supposed to do?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "How do we move forward from this? From everything that's already been set in motion?" "We create our own path," Julius said, his voice firm, though it held a tenderness that made my heart ache. "We choose each other. We face the consequences, whatever they may be, together." I took a deep breath, my mind racing as I tried to process everything he had just said. I thought about my life, the career I had built, the stability I had created, the walls I had carefully constructed around myself. I had spent my whole life planning for a future that was predictable, that didn't require me to take risks, to throw myself into the unknown. But now, in this moment, I realized that I was ready. I was ready to choose him. I was ready to choose love. "I don't know what the future holds," I whispered, "but I know that I can't let you go." A smile broke across Julius's face, and the weight that had been pressing down on my chest seemed to lift. He pulled me into his arms, holding me tightly as if he had been waiting for this moment for far too long. "I'm not letting you go, Emma," he said softly, his lips brushing against my forehead. "Not now, not ever." Just as we stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, Lady Isabella's voice rang out once more, breaking the stillness of the room. "I have no objections," she said, her voice clear and calm. "I understand why you're doing this, Julius. I've known for a long time. And I'll support you, whatever choice you make." Her words were unexpected, but they carried a quiet strength. She had always known, hadn't she? She had always known that Julius's heart wasn't hers to claim. The political alliance, The duty, the ceremony, none of it had been real to him. But it had been real to her. Isabella stepped forward, her eyes meeting mine, and for the first time, I saw something in her that I hadn't expected: understanding. "You have him now," she said, her voice soft. "And I wish you both the happiness that I could never have." I didn't know what to say to that, so I simply nodded. For the first time, there was no animosity between us. Only mutual recognition. The guests had been murmuring amongst themselves, their confusion palpable as they tried to process the events unfolding before them. But as Julius and I stood together, hand in hand, I realized that the wedding I had spent weeks planning wasn't going to happen the way anyone expected. And yet, it didn't matter. Julius looked down at me, his eyes filled with a quiet intensity that I couldn't quite place. He wasn't just the king anymore. He was mine. "I don't know what happens next," he said, his voice hushed, "but I know that I want to face it with you." "I want that too," I whispered, my heart overflowing with a love I had never known was possible. And in that moment, everything else fell away: the kingdom, the alliances, the expectations. All that mattered was the man standing in front of me, the man who had chosen me. And as we stepped forward together, ready to face whatever the future held, I knew one thing for certain. We would build our own path. Together. The cathedral was still. The remnants of last night's ceremony lingered in the air, the faint scent of flowers, the waxy remnants of candles that had burned late into the night, and the hushed murmurs of the guests as they filed out of the grand hall, unsure of what they had just witnessed. I sat in the back corner of the vast cathedral, the grand silence almost suffocating. There was no music now, no laughter or chatter. The only sound was the soft rustling of fabric and the echoes of my own thoughts, the weight of what had happened pressing down on my chest. My mind was still reeling from the events of yesterday, from the way Julius had claimed me before all those people, before everyone, and the way Isabella had stood by, offering her understanding and support. She had been graceful in her acceptance, her quiet strength and resolve speaking volumes. It had been a shocking moment for all of us, but in the end, I knew her silence had been her way of setting both of us free. I glanced over at Julius, who stood across the room, talking quietly with his closest advisors, his back to me. He was dressed simply now, no crown upon his head, just the man I had come to know over these past few weeks, calm, focused, and yet undeniably burdened by the weight of his own decisions. But he wasn't just a king anymore. He was my partner, my equal. And for that, I had never been more grateful. As I stood up and moved to the back of the cathedral, a soft breeze drifted through the open windows, ruffling the delicate fabric of my dress. I had only just begun to get used to the quiet warmth of Julius's presence when I realized the gravity of the situation was starting to sink in. We had broken with tradition, with expectations, and with everything we had been taught. Now, there was nothing left but the future, a future we had to build, piece by piece, against the tide of political pressure and social expectations. The door creaked open, and Julius entered the back room, his gaze immediately finding mine. There was no hesitation in his steps now, no retreat. He crossed the floor toward me with purpose, his face set in determination. "You okay?" he asked, his voice soft, though I could hear the worry beneath the surface. He had every right to be worried. We had just disrupted the kingdom's most important political alliance. His council, his advisors, they would not let this go easily. I nodded, though I couldn't quite bring myself to smile. There was still so much to process. "Just a little overwhelmed, I suppose," I said, trying to lighten the mood, though the weight of it all lingered in the air. "You've just done something monumental. The world has noticed." Julius sighed, his hand reaching for mine, and I let him take it without hesitation. The warmth of his touch grounded me in that moment, reminding me that we were no longer two people bound by duty and expectation. We were two people forging a path for ourselves, together. "I know," he said, his tone a mixture of resolve and uncertainty. "But I can't go back. I've spent my life following orders, living up to other people's expectations. It's time I started living for myself. For us." I felt my heart stir at his words. "Us," I repeated softly, allowing the weight of that one word to settle in my chest. I never imagined this for myself. I thought I had everything planned out. My work, my career, I never expected to be here, in this place, with you. He gave me a small smile, the kind that spoke of understanding and patience. "I didn't expect it either, Emma. But I'm not sorry for it. Not even for a second." I smiled then, though it was tinged with sadness. But we're not just changing our own lives. This decision affects everything, Julius. The council, the kingdom. People will talk. I know, he said, his voice firm but filled with an underlying sadness. But what good is a kingdom if it's built on lies? What good is ruling if you're not free to love? I squeezed his hand, grateful for his certainty even as my own doubts crept in. And what about your family? Your people? They'll adjust, Julius said, though the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes revealed the truth behind his words. They have to. My heart belongs to you, Emma. You've shown me a kind of freedom I never thought I could have. And for that, I'm willing to face whatever comes. As the day wore on, we were inundated with the inevitable fallout from our actions. The council arrived in full force, their faces a mix of disbelief, anger, and, surprisingly, begrudging acceptance. Julius had prepared for this. I hadn't. They were angry, yes, but more than that, they were afraid. They feared that Julius's decision would destabilize everything they had worked to build, the alliances, the power structures, the future of the kingdom. I could see it in their eyes as they circled around us, their voices rising with every new complaint, every new demand. You can't simply discard the alliance with House Vane, one of the council members said, his voice cold and sharp. This will have repercussions that will affect not just your reign, but the stability of the entire kingdom. Julius didn't flinch. He stood tall, his gaze unwavering, his hand still tightly gripping mine. The kingdom I want to build is one of honesty and freedom, not one of political games and forced marriages. We will find a way to move forward, but it won't be by bowing to tradition. I could see the strain in his eyes. He was being pulled in every direction, his people, his advisors, the expectations of the crown all crashing down on him. But for the first time, I realized something: he wasn't alone. I was here. And together, we would figure this out. We can fix this, I said, speaking up for the first time, my voice steady, though the weight of the situation pressed on me. There are alliances we can forge, new paths we can carve. We can rebuild the trust we need. But we need time. We need the chance to make our own decisions, to build our own future. The room fell silent. All eyes were on me now, and I felt my heart race in my chest. I wasn't a politician. I wasn't a queen. I was just a woman who had found herself in the middle of a storm. But I knew this: if anyone could weather this storm, it was Julius. And I would stand by him, no matter the cost. As the day came to a close and the council left, their murmurs of dissatisfaction still echoing in the halls, I turned to Julius. He was exhausted, his face drawn with the weight of everything he was facing. But there was something else in his eyes, too. There was hope. And I felt it too. We'll make it, he said quietly, his hand gently caressing my cheek. Together. I nodded, the certainty of his words wrapping around me like a warm embrace. There was so much uncertainty ahead, so many challenges to face. But for the first time, I wasn't afraid. We had already taken the hardest step, we had chosen each other. Now, it was time to build our future. And so, as the evening wore on, Julius and I stood in the ruins of what had once been a political ceremony, and we began to rebuild. Not just the kingdom, but our lives. We were no longer bound by the chains of duty and expectation. We were free. In the weeks that followed, there were adjustments to be made. The kingdom was uneasy. The council grumbled. But slowly, with every decision we made, with every plan we executed together, things began to shift. The people, initially hesitant, began to see that Julius was still the leader they had always known, but now, he was a leader who had the courage to follow his heart. And I was no longer just the wedding planner. I was his partner, his confidant. Together, we navigated the complexities of his reign, and we learned to trust each other in ways we never had before. We didn't have it all figured out, but we were building something real, something that was ours. A future where we were free to love, free to lead, and free to live the life we had chosen together. The early days of our decision to be together were a whirlwind. We'd chosen each other, and in doing so, we had taken the first step into a new world, one where the expectations of a kingdom no longer dictated every decision. Still, the reality of Julius's position couldn't be ignored. While he had made the choice to follow his heart, the burdens of leadership were never far behind. I watched him as he sat behind the grand wooden desk in his study, his fingers pressed against his temples, his brow furrowed. The pile of scrolls before him, filled with reports from his advisers, from his council, and from his military, was enough to weigh down even the most hardened king. But Julius never seemed to back down from a challenge, no matter how exhausting it became. "We can't keep putting things off," he muttered to himself, flipping through one of the scrolls with a restless hand. "We need a new trade agreement with the Eastern Territories before the harvest season. And I need a military advisor who can help restructure our defenses." I stood in the doorway, watching him in silence. The weight of leadership had always been his companion. And while it was a burden I knew he carried alone, I couldn't help but feel that there was more than just the kingdom pulling him in every direction. There was something else, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. "Julius," I said quietly, stepping into the room. He looked up, his stormy eyes catching mine, and for the briefest moment, the tension that had built up over the past few weeks seemed to dissipate. "Emma," he said, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. He motioned to the chair across from him. "You're here. Good. I needed a break from all this. I've been thinking about what you said yesterday." "What did I say?" I asked, moving to sit down. "You mentioned the people. The kingdom. You said we needed to find a way to make them understand." He paused, leaning back in his chair. "I've been trying to figure out how we can make this work, how we can balance what I need with what they expect. It's not easy." I sat forward, my elbows resting on my knees, and watched him closely. He was trying. I knew he was. The enormity of his responsibilities weighed heavily on him, and the political ramifications of his decisions were only just beginning to unfold. But for the first time since I met him, I saw a glimmer of uncertainty in his eyes. "We don't have all the answers," I said softly, my voice gentle but firm. "But I think we can start by being honest. Honest with ourselves, honest with the kingdom, and honest with each other." He looked at me, his eyes searching mine, and for a moment, I saw the vulnerability he had hidden beneath his kingly exterior. "I don't know how to do this," he confessed. "I don't know how to lead in the way I should, and still follow my heart. I don't want to disappoint them, but I don't want to lose you either." "You won't lose me," I said, standing and walking toward him. I reached out, placing my hand on his shoulder, and he leaned into my touch, closing his eyes briefly. "But we have to make choices that honor who we are. If we keep living for everyone else, we'll lose ourselves." He nodded, his hand resting on top of mine, and the simple act of connection calmed both of us. The weight of his crown, the burden of his duties, would always be with him. But so long as we held on to each other, there was hope. There was a way forward. It wasn't long before we had to face the council. Julius had avoided them in the first few weeks, knowing that his decision to be with me would be met with resistance. But the time had come for us to stand together, to face the consequences of his choices head-on. I had never been to one of these meetings before. I had heard of them, of course. They were the domain of kings and queens, advisors, and those who held the power to make or break a kingdom. But now, as I sat in the grand chamber of the council hall, I felt a strange mix of anticipation and dread. I wasn't just a wedding planner anymore. I wasn't a passive observer in the kingdom's politics. I was now part of this world, for better or for worse. Julius sat at the head of the long table, his posture straight and his expression unreadable. The council members filled the seats around him, their faces a mix of skepticism and disapproval. Their voices murmured low, and I could feel the tension in the air like a storm gathering. "Your Majesty," one of the councillors began, his voice clipped and formal, "we must discuss the ramifications of your recent decisions. The alliance with House Vane was not just for the benefit of the crown. It was a political necessity." "I understand that," Julius replied, his voice calm but firm. "But I will no longer make decisions based on political necessity alone. I have made my choice." "And what about the kingdom?" another councillor interjected. "What about the stability of the realm? This is not just about your personal desires. This affects us all." "It's always been about stability," Julius replied, his voice rising slightly. "But the stability of the kingdom is meaningless if I am not allowed to live authentically. If I am forced to marry someone I do not love, then what is the point? We are not a kingdom of forced marriages. We are a kingdom of freedom, of choice. And I will not be part of anything less than that." I watched the councillors exchange glances, their expressions skeptical but growing more thoughtful. They had never seen Julius speak this way before. He had always been composed, always been the king they respected and feared. But now, he was someone different, someone who had the courage to follow his heart, despite the consequences. One of the older counselors, a man with graying hair and sharp eyes, finally spoke up. You speak of freedom, Your Majesty, but what of the kingdom's freedom? What of the alliances that have been formed, the trust that has been established? I have not discarded the alliances, Julius said, his voice steady. But we will move forward in a way that honors our vision for this kingdom, not one built on the back of an alliance that was never mine to begin with. The room was silent for a long moment. And then, slowly, one by one, the councillors began to nod. It wasn't a sweeping approval, but it was something. They were acknowledging Julius's decision, and they were starting to see that he was not the same man who had been guided by the will of others. He was a man who was willing to fight for his own happiness, his own truth. Finally, the graying councillor spoke again. Very well. We will proceed with caution, Your Majesty. But we will support you, in this, and in whatever comes next. The days that followed were filled with challenges, but there was a new sense of unity between Julius and I. The council had given their reluctant blessing, but there was still much work to be done. We had to rebuild trust with the kingdom, rebuild the political alliances that had been shaken by our choices. But as we worked together, side by side, I could feel the connection between us strengthening. Julius was no longer just the king in a gilded cage. He was a man who had fought for his right to live authentically, and together, we were building something real, something based on trust, love, and honesty. And for the first time in my life, I felt like I was exactly where I was meant to be. Not as the wedding planner, not as the woman trying to be invisible in the background, but as the woman by Julius's side. His partner. His equal. The air was thick with the scent of fresh pine and the rustling of autumn leaves as we walked through the royal gardens, Julius's hand nestled firmly in mine. It was early morning, and the first rays of sunlight pierced through the trees, casting long shadows across the lush landscape. The silence between us was peaceful, a stark contrast to the chaos that had surrounded us in the past few weeks. For the first time since everything had changed, I felt as though I could breathe again. Julius had insisted that we take a morning walk before diving into the day's work. He had a busy schedule ahead of him, filled with meetings and decisions that would determine the future of the kingdom. But, for now, it was just the two of us, walking side by side in the calm of the royal gardens. I couldn't help but marvel at the sight of him. He was the same Julius who had always been the center of power, a king who carried the weight of his people's expectations on his shoulders. But now, with me by his side, he seemed lighter, more human. And for the first time, I realized that the man I had come to love wasn't just a ruler, he was a person who, like me, was navigating the unknown, trying to build a future that was true to his heart. Have you had time to think? I asked, glancing up at him. About what happens next? He nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. I've been thinking about it a lot. It's going to take time, but I'm committed to this, to you and to our future. We stopped walking for a moment, and I looked up at him, my heart swelling with emotion. His gaze softened as he met my eyes, and I could see the resolve in his features. The world had thrown so many challenges at us, but we had chosen each other. We had chosen to fight for something real. I know it won't be easy, he continued, his voice quiet but filled with conviction. There are people who will resist. The council, the nobles, even my own family. But I can't let that stop us. I won't. I smiled, squeezing his hand. We've already faced the hardest part. We've chosen to be together. We've made that decision. His lips curved upward into a smile, and I could see the weight of his responsibility lifting from his shoulders, even if only for a brief moment. I think we've only just begun, he said softly. Despite our shared resolve, the political realities of our situation had not disappeared. Julius's decision to marry for love, rather than political gain, had sent shockwaves through the kingdom. His council, initially reluctant, had begrudgingly agreed to support him, but their skepticism remained. The political alliances that had been built through his marriage to Lady Isabella were not easily discarded, and the kingdom's stability hung in the balance. We had spent the last few days meeting with advisors and strategizing, but the tension in the air was palpable. No matter how much I tried to immerse myself in the day-to-day operations of the kingdom, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were walking on a tightrope, one misstep away from disaster. I know they don't trust us, Julius said one evening, after another tense meeting with the council. They think we're unprepared, that I've made a rash decision. But I'm not going to back down. I nodded in agreement, but I could feel the weight of the uncertainty pressing down on me as well. The council was slow to warm to our vision for the kingdom, and while Julius had promised to stand by his decisions, I could see the strain it was putting on him. "You can't carry the weight of the world on your own," I said gently, my hand resting on his shoulder. "We have to build trust. It won't happen overnight, but we'll get there. Together." Julius sighed, his shoulders sagging slightly as he ran a hand through his hair. "I'm trying, Emma. But it's hard. It feels like everyone is watching, waiting for me to fail." "They are waiting to see if you'll remain true to your word," I replied, my voice firm with conviction. "And you will. You're not like the others. You're different. You're leading with your heart, and that will make all the difference." He looked at me, his eyes filled with a quiet gratitude. "I don't deserve you," he said, his voice low. "You do," I replied softly. "You always have." Days turned into weeks, and the kingdom slowly began to adjust to the new reality. The people, for the most part, had been receptive to Julius's new approach to leadership. He had begun to meet with local leaders, opening new lines of communication and forging relationships with those who had once been skeptical of him. He was building a foundation of trust, one that would be essential for the kingdom's future. And then, one morning, as we sat in the royal study reviewing documents, we received word that one of the key trade agreements, one that had been stalling for months, had been finalized. "It's done," Julius said, looking at the parchment with a mixture of disbelief and pride. "We've secured a trade deal with the Eastern Territories. This could be the breakthrough we needed." I couldn't help but smile, feeling a surge of pride for him. "See? I told you that if you led with your heart, people would follow." Julius's face broke into a grin, and he stood up, moving across the room to where I was seated. He knelt down in front of me, taking my hands in his. "This is just the beginning, Emma. I couldn't have done it without you." I shook my head, feeling the weight of his words settle in my chest. "We've done it together," I said softly. "This is just the first victory. There will be more." He nodded, his expression filled with determination. "Together," he repeated, squeezing my hands. "We'll rebuild this kingdom. We'll build it on trust, on love, and on the freedom to choose." The days continued to unfold with both triumph and challenge, and though the road ahead was uncertain, one thing had become clear. Julius and I were no longer just two people navigating a complicated situation. We were partners, committed not only to the future of the kingdom but to each other. As we stood together in the royal gardens one evening, the sun setting behind us, I couldn't help but feel a sense of peace settle over me. The future was still unknown, still full of obstacles, but for the first time in my life, I knew that I wasn't alone. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," Julius said, his voice low as he looked at me, his eyes filled with unwavering certainty. I turned to face him, the soft evening light catching the edges of his face, and I saw a man who was no longer bound by duty or expectation. He had chosen to follow his heart, and in doing so, he had found a way to build something real, something that was truly his own. "I've always been sure of you," I replied, my voice steady but filled with emotion. "And I've always been sure of us." He smiled, his eyes bright, and he reached out to pull me closer. "This kingdom is ours, Emma. Ours to shape. And we'll shape it the way we choose." As his lips met mine in a soft kiss, I knew that whatever the future held, we would face it together. The challenges, the victories, the uncertainty, we would face it as one. And in that moment, with the future stretching before us, I knew we were ready. It had been weeks since Julius had made the bold decision to marry for love instead of political gain, and while things had begun to settle in some respects, the aftershocks of his decision continued to reverberate through the kingdom. The council had grudgingly accepted the new reality, but they remained skeptical. The nobles had shown their discontent in subtle ways: a refusal to attend royal functions, a deliberate disregard for Julius's new approach to leadership, and whispers that I could feel at the back of my neck whenever I passed through the halls. Still, Julius held firm. He had made a choice, and he was unwilling to turn back. Together, we were laying the groundwork for a kingdom built on freedom and transparency, but the road ahead was far from smooth. The pressure began to mount, slowly at first. It was subtle, a missing letter here, a delayed message there. It wasn't until the first real crisis hit that I began to understand just how fragile the kingdom's stability was. We had received word that an alliance Julius had hoped to secure with a neighboring territory was faltering. The details were vague at first, but it soon became clear that certain factions within the council were working behind the scenes to undermine Julius's authority. They didn't want change. They didn't want to relinquish the power they had grown accustomed to. The kingdom was in peril, and we had no choice but to face it head-on. The council chamber had never felt more suffocating. The walls seemed to close in around me as I sat at the table, my hand gripping the arm of the chair in an attempt to steady myself. Julius was seated at the head of the table, as always, but today his expression was different. It was as though the weight of the crown had settled on his shoulders once more, and this time, the pressure wasn't just political. It was personal. "We've lost communication with the eastern border," one of the advisors spoke, his voice heavy with concern. "The trade routes are becoming more dangerous, and our allies are beginning to pull away. This has been a slow unraveling, Your Majesty, but now it's threatening to topple everything we've worked for." Julius didn't flinch. He didn't lose his composure. But I could see the storm brewing behind his eyes, the same storm that had been gathering since the moment he made the decision to follow his heart. "This can't be happening," Julius muttered under his breath, his hand gripping the edge of the table. His knuckles were white, his jaw tight. "We can't lose this now. We've only just begun." "Your Majesty," another advisor spoke, her voice measured. "With all due respect, there are factions within the council that are dissatisfied with the course you've taken. They believe your decisions are too risky, too idealistic. And they are beginning to question whether you can protect the kingdom as you've promised." I glanced at Julius, my heart aching for him. He had always been the unshakable king, the one who carried the kingdom on his shoulders with unwavering resolve. But I could see the cracks now, the fear in his eyes, the uncertainty that had begun to settle into his bones. "We're not going to back down," he said, his voice low but firm. "We've come too far." I felt the pull of the moment, the weight of the choices we had made together. I stood up from my seat, moving around the table to where Julius sat today. His gaze followed me as I approached, and I placed a hand on his shoulder, offering silent support. "We'll find a way to make it work," I said, my voice steady. "We've faced challenges before, and we've made it through. We'll do the same now." He looked up at me, his stormy eyes filled with gratitude and something deeper. The connection between us had only grown stronger over the past few months, and I knew that we were in this together, whatever came next. But even as I spoke those words, I knew we were facing a different kind of challenge. One that threatened everything we had built. Not just as a couple, but as a kingdom. It wasn't long before the betrayal came to light. It started with whispers, rumors about certain members of the council meeting secretly with foreign powers, attempting to form alliances without Julius's knowledge. At first, I couldn't believe it. These were men and women who had pledged their loyalty to the crown, who had sworn to serve Julius. How could they betray him now, when he was trying to rebuild the kingdom? But the evidence was irrefutable. Letters were found, sealed with the insignia of other kingdoms, speaking of covert deals and arrangements. And when one of the advisors was caught in the act of conspiring with a neighboring king, it all came crashing down. Julius's face was unreadable when the news broke, but I could see the strain in his shoulders, the clench of his jaw as he processed the betrayal. The very people who were supposed to support him had turned against him, and it cut deeper than I could have imagined. "We need to act quickly," one of the council members said, his voice urgent. "If we don't, the Eastern Territories will be lost to us. And the alliances we've worked so hard to build will fall apart." "I know," Julius replied, his voice quiet but resolute. "But we can't make a rash decision. We need to understand who is truly behind this. We need to find the root of the problem." I watched him closely, sensing the conflict brewing within him. He had always been decisive, always the leader who acted swiftly and with conviction. But now, it seemed like the weight of the kingdom was pressing down on him in a way that was different from before. The trust he had placed in his advisors had been shattered. The foundation of his reign was in jeopardy. "I'll get to the bottom of this," he said, his voice firm once more, as he turned to address the council. "But we must be careful. We cannot let fear drive us to make the wrong choice." Later that evening, after the council had disbanded and Julius had retired to his chambers, I found myself standing alone in the royal garden, my hands wrapped around the cool stone railing. The night air was crisp, and the stars above were bright, shining through the inky darkness. It was a peaceful moment, one that allowed me to breathe, to collect my thoughts. Julius had been through so much already. The weight of his crown had always been heavy, but now it felt unbearable. His decision to follow his heart, to choose me, had been the first step toward a new future. But now, that same future was crumbling before us. "Emma," I turned to find Julius standing in the doorway of the garden, his eyes searching mine. He had changed into a simple tunic, his royal garb replaced by something more comfortable. But the look on his face was anything but relaxed. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice rough. "I didn't mean to pull you into this mess. You shouldn't have to face this with me." I shook my head, walking toward him. "You're not alone in this, Julius. We're in this together." He took a deep breath, his shoulders sagging slightly as he let the weight of the moment settle over him. "I don't know how to fix this. I don't know how to fix what's been broken." "You've already fixed so much," I replied softly, reaching out to touch his arm. "You've chosen to lead with your heart. That's more than anyone could ever ask of you." For a long moment, we stood in silence, the night surrounding us, the weight of the world pressing down on both of us. But as I looked up at him, I knew one thing for certain. We would face whatever came next, together. We had already made that choice. And whatever the future held, we would build it side by side. The days following the betrayal were filled with tension, but also determination. Julius, despite the weight of the kingdom pressing down on him, had shown a resilience I had never seen before. He faced the council, his advisors, and even his own family with a new sense of conviction, but it was clear that the forces working against us would not give up easily. Every day brought new challenges, new obstacles to navigate, and more resistance from the very people who had sworn loyalty to him. But Julius remained unwavering. He had made his choice, not just to love me, but to lead with honesty, with integrity, and with a commitment to the future of his kingdom. He would not allow his reign to be dictated by the whims of political schemers, nor would he let fear take away the life he had finally begun to build for himself and for us. And as for me, I had always been the planner, the one who worked in the shadows, making sure everything went smoothly without ever asking for anything in return. But now, I was a part of this. I was a partner, and I knew that this kingdom, this life, was something we would build together. The council had called for a final meeting to address the situation. The tension in the room was palpable, and the weight of what hung in the balance was overwhelming. But I knew that this was it. This was the moment where everything would either break or solidify. Julius stood at the head of the table, his posture straight and commanding, his eyes focused on the gathered advisors and council members who were still unsure of him. There were murmurs of discontent, some nodding their heads in agreement, others shaking their heads with disdain. But Julius didn't flinch. "Enough," Julius said, his voice cutting through the murmurs like a blade. "I've heard all the arguments. I've listened to all your concerns. But we cannot move forward with fear. We cannot build a future based on old traditions that no longer serve us. We've had enough of that." I stood by his side, my presence a silent support, my heart swelling with pride. I had never seen him this determined, this sure of himself. One of the council members, an older man with graying hair and sharp eyes, spoke up. "Your Majesty, you have made your personal choices clear. But what of the kingdom? What of the alliances that have been jeopardized?" "I will not apologize for choosing to live honestly," Julius replied firmly, his eyes scanning the room. "The alliances we have lost, we will rebuild, on our terms. I am not asking you to follow me blindly. I am asking you to trust that we are making the right decision. I've made the choice to marry for love, for freedom. And I will make sure that this kingdom we are building, will thrive because of that choice." There was a long pause, the tension so thick that it was almost tangible. I could feel the weight of their judgment in the air, but I could also feel something else, something that had shifted in the room. A quiet understanding. A reluctant respect. Then, slowly, the older council member nodded, his eyes narrowing as he met Julius's gaze. "You have my support, Your Majesty," he said, his voice grudging but sincere. "But know this, the road ahead will be difficult. You cannot do this alone." "I don't plan on it," Julius said, turning to look at me, his eyes softening. "I never have." The days following the council's meeting were filled with activity. Slowly but surely, the foundation of change began to take root. Julius and I worked together to rebuild the trust that had been shattered, forging new alliances where they had once seemed impossible. The nobles who had resisted us began to see the sincerity in Julius's leadership, and the people of the kingdom began to rally behind us. But as the political landscape began to settle, it was clear that the hardest work was yet to come. This was only the beginning. I had always known the weight of responsibility that came with leadership. But as Julius and I faced the future together, I realized that our love, our commitment to each other, was what would hold everything together. The kingdom could survive, it would thrive, but it was our bond that would be the glue holding it all in place. Weeks turned into months, and Julius and I continued to navigate the intricacies of leadership and love. The kingdom had settled into a new rhythm, one that balanced both the responsibilities of power and the personal choices that came with them. Julius had learned to trust not only in himself but also in me. We worked together to ensure that every decision made was one that aligned with our vision for the kingdom, a vision built on love, honesty, and mutual respect. It wasn't easy, but nothing worth having ever was. One evening, as we stood on the balcony of the royal palace, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I realized how far we had come. The kingdom was healing. So were we. The battles we had fought, both within ourselves and against the world around us, had made us stronger, more united. Do you remember the day we stood here together, watching the sunset? I asked, my voice soft, almost wistful. Julius smiled, his arm slipping around my waist as he pulled me close. I remember, he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. I remember how uncertain I was. How afraid I was that I was making the wrong choice. And now? I asked, tilting my head to look up at him. Now, he said, his voice low and full of love, I know I made the right choice. I know that the kingdom we're building, the life we're living, is the life I was always meant to have. I smiled, my heart swelling with pride and love. It's not just the kingdom, Julius, I whispered. It's us. We're building our own future. He kissed the top of my head, holding me close. Together. I closed my eyes, savoring the moment, the peace that had finally settled between us. There would still be challenges ahead. The kingdom was always evolving, always in need of change, but for the first time, I knew that we were ready. We had built something strong, something unshakable. And as the sun set over the kingdom we had chosen to build, I knew that no matter what came next, we would face it, together. The years that followed were marked by both triumph and hardship. The kingdom grew stronger, its foundations built on the love and trust that Julius and I had forged together. We faced battles, both external and internal, but with every challenge, our bond grew deeper. The kingdom flourished as we worked tirelessly to ensure that both the political and personal aspects of leadership were balanced with integrity. Julius became a king who led with his heart, a king who valued love and honesty above all else. And I, once just a wedding planner, became his queen, not just in title, but in spirit. Together, we built a future for our people, for our family, and for ourselves. The road had been long, and at times, the weight of the crown had felt unbearable. But as we stood side by side, looking out over the kingdom we had built, I knew that we had created something truly special. A kingdom not just ruled by a king, but by the love that had brought us together. And in the end, that was all that mattered.